he could have. But no one's been with the mountaineering rangers longer than Roger, and no one's been pushing as hard, as far as I can tell, as he has for that entire time to try to clean up the mountain. I mean, a lot of people have worked on what he just talked about, but he was the driver in the times that I've been around. And so he's had a shout out along with Ellen for organizing this, but for the work he's done on Denali. How about for Raj, huh? Yeah, come on. And then I don't know, it's gonna have to be a loud hand for Pam because I want her to hear this. There she is. So most of you probably know Pam, Roger's wife. She's been doing all the food, working really hard back there. But what I didn't know is she also had to tolerate all these experiments at her house for the last few years. She didn't sign up for that. And so for making the food for us and organizing and for tolerating Roger, how about for Pam? All right. All right. Thank you for humoring me for that. So I'm Mike Loso. I'm at Alaska Pacific University. It's a little private college up in Anchorage. Great little place to teach or to be a student. I'm going to talk about some research that I did with a whole bunch of students. So I want to really point out and acknowledge Katie Goodwin, Haley Williams, Rich Johnson, Dustin English. These are all APU students. Dustin is still a guide on Denali after he finished at APU. These are undergraduates and graduate students that have done a lot of the work, both on the mountain and in the lab that I'm going to be talking about. And it's been a pleasure to work with them. They've done a lot of the work. And I also want to acknowledge another co-author, Matthias Braun, who's was at the time at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and now he's moved back to Germany, but he helped with a little bit of this work too. And so anyway, thanks to all of them. This work was funded by Denali National Park, as Roger was saying. They came to me to ask if I could help answer this question of what's going on with all the human waste that's going into the crevasses. And I do want to clarify, because I'm not sure, based on that last question, if it was clear, that a lot of the waste still does go in the crevasses on the mountain. It's perfectly consistent with the regulations that when you're going up or down the mountain, but you're not at the highest camp or camps, you're allowed to throw your waste out of the Clean Mountain can into crevasses. And I don't think that's bad. I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. I'll come back to that. But hence the question, then what? And that's what this research is about. And I'm going to give you this kind of obscure photo here is a hint. Is it a spoiler? Spoiler alert, I think. So this is a photo I took. I started this research in 2007. I got to go up on the mountain and do a rescue patrol with my friend Tucker Chenoweth, one of the Denali Rangers, and collect some data along the way. And when we were going up, we were somewhere near Ski Hill, I think. I saw this serac in the distance. It was far away. I took this with one of those digital zooms that doesn't work very well. But what I was seeing, this is a big serac that's many meters high. And what I was drawn to when I saw it was this line right here. That's a layer of tephra, or volcanic ash, that I recognized because the first time I was on Denali was in 1992. I was a guide for the American Alpine Institute. And we woke up one morning and got out of our tents, and the whole world was gray. And the snow was gray, the sky was gray, snow was falling out of the sky, and it was gray. And we didn't know what was happening. The technology wasn't as good then as it is now. But we did eventually find out that what happened is Mount Spur erupted. And this was ash falling out from that eruption. We got to the summit, we had a nice trip, but I'm a skier, it was a terrible trip because the snow was just wrecked by this volcanic ash that really accelerated the melt. And so it's kind of a big event for me. It was my first trip on Denali. And here I was, 15 years later or something, and I was like, oh, there's that ash. It's still there. It's buried under, I counted the layers to make sure I wasn't fooling myself, 15 years of snow, but it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still sitting there. And that's kind of what this talk is about, is what happens to something when you sort of bury it on a glacier. This is a photo taken from This is on a different glacier where I do a lot of research. It's the Kahiltna Glacier, which is a small glacier near Anchorage. And it so happens that in 2009, this happens somewhat frequently, another volcano erupted in Alaska, Mount Redoubt, and destroyed the skiing for my spring ski trip once again. It covered, I think you got a little bit of it on Denali, but I wasn't on Denali that year, but it dumped a bunch of ash on the Kahiltna Glacier, where we spend the whole month of May, me and my students. But that's not what you're seeing here. What happened is it ruined the skiing, it accelerated the melt. We had a super negative balance year, meaning the glacier really melted a lot that year. And what it melted down to was the 1992 Mount Spur tephra. That's what that black layer is right there. And then I was like, oh, here it is again. You know, so if I'm not being clear enough, what I'm trying to get across is you can bury something on a glacier, it's not gone forever. It's still there, and the question that I'm trying to answer with this research is so then what? You know, so those turds are still there, what becomes of them? That's really the question that the park asked me to answer, and so this is what we've found out. They're kind of done with the project now. So there's the Kahiltna Glacier. Most of you are familiar with it. I do want to emphasize that that's the climbing route there in blue. So there's a lot of glacier downstream of there that most people, including me, have not seen or spent any time on. It's a 80-kilometer, almost 80-kilometer long glacier. It's big. And the climbers spend all their time on the uppermost part of the glacier. If we look at the climbing route in detail, so this is just that box, I numbered, this has been published in a couple places, this work, and they didn't like me using the local names for the camps, but for those of you that know the place, this is the base camp where you fly into. That's 7,800 feet. Ski hill, the 11 camp, and then there's the sort of high camp where the rangers hang out. I shouldn't call it the high camp, but the 14 camp in Janae Basin. There's that long ridge. That's the real high camp where Roger's failed plywood pooper went. And then there's the summit. So this is where everyone spends their time, and this was sort of the focus of my research if you're not familiar with this setting. So just to recap, because I think Roger already set the scene pretty well, this is the problem, is this is in the wilderness, and anyone who's gone backpacking in Denali knows that they have really strict quotas in most areas. There's very few people on the trail. There's really hardly any trails. And when you go in the backcountry in Denali, you don't see anyone. It's like totally, except for one place, ironically, the highest part of the park. There's a lot of people there, but it is wilderness, and it's a place where, as we all know, you know, human waste doesn't, that's what this whole thing is about, right? Is like waste is hard to deal with at high elevation. So that's the problem that Roger and others have been working on. He just showed you the climber numbers. This is basically the same graph in red, showing you the climber numbers accelerating from Washburn's first climb in 51 up to the present. But what I've done is converted that by the always debated question of how heavy the average poop is. You'd be surprised. That has generated more interest from my research than anything else. Even up to like yesterday, people like, how did you come up with the weight of a poop? It's a big question. It's not worth talking about. Let's just say I picked an average. Roger has debated me and said, no, they're bigger on Denali. So maybe that's true. He's been there longer than anyone. So this is an underestimate because Denali poops are bigger, apparently. But the important point here is if you do the math that you've got like over 2 metric tons of just poop being deposited by climbers on the glacier every year presently. And we don't know the exact amount, but a large fraction of that is going into crevasses because that's permitted. So we don't know, is it 80% of that goes in crevasses or 70%? But the point is that's a lot of poop. The present management system works really well to clean up the surface of the glacier. It is, I think anyone who's been there would attest, it's one of the cleanest mountains you can climb on anywhere. And you know, thanks in large part to the work Roger's been doing. But the poop is still there. So what happens from there? So, quick primer for anyone who's not familiar with how glaciers work. This is a cross-section of a hypothetical glacier, and the two important concepts are that you have an accumulation zone, the upper area where it snows more than it melts, and so you always have perennial snows. And then you have an ablation zone where it may snow in the winter, but it melts more than it snows. And when it melts all of the winter snows in the ablation zone, you melt down to ice and maybe some rock because the glacier flows. And this excess snow here is compressed, turns into ice, and moves downstream into the ablation zone. And the boundary between them is the equilibrium line. The entire climbing route at Denali is in the accumulation zone. If any of you who were here at the panel yesterday or the day before, I mentioned the ranger in Wrangell St. Elias who wanted to crevasse waste in the ablation zone, bad practice. But fortunately, the whole climbing route is in the accumulation zone in Denali. And so what happens is this. You bury the waste, and as it gets carried downstream by the flow of the glacier, it gets buried ever more deeply because every year as it's transiting through the accumulation zone, more snow is accumulating on it. So it's effectively burrowing its way down deeper into the glacier until it passes the equilibrium line. And then as it continues downstream in the ablation zone, every year it gets shallower as the ice melts. And eventually it surfaces again. And importantly, unless you're talking about a tidewater glacier, one that goes into the ocean, you don't expect the waste to calve off the end of the glacier. It's actually going to emerge somewhere on the glacier surface upstream of the terminus. And in fact, if you bury it at the head of the glacier, you'd expect to see it way down here. If you bury it close to the equilibrium line, it'll emerge a very short distance downstream because it doesn't get buried very deeply before it gets to the equilibrium line, and then it starts to melt out again. So that's kind of the basic physics, I guess, of what we're looking at. And these are the questions that we try to answer. Well, where is this waste going to come out? When is it going to come out? When it does, these were the questions that were hard for me to answer because I'm a glaciologist. I'll tell you how I went about this. The bacterial survival of the organisms in the waste, what does that look like? Are those bacteria and other microbes making it into the water that's coming out of the terminus of the glacier, the Kahiltna River? And then briefly, I'm just going to talk about a last little piece, which is, okay, given what we know, what are the implications of this? It's not my decision what to do, but what are some of the implications of this for the managers here who do have to decide what to do about it? So the first piece here, in terms of some results, I'm going to try not to get too sciencey, but then again, some of you like science. I know it. No one's asleep yet, so I'm going to go forward, is figuring out how fast the glacier moves. And we did that in two particular ways. One, you can see here's the Kahiltna. All these little blue dots or green dots or that have arrows on them. Actually, they're all blue. Those are places where either we or in some cases other investigators have placed stakes on the ice, drilled them into the ice, used GPS, come back later in the season, get a velocity from the movement of that stake over time. If you look at that in close-up, there's the climbing route. Here's base camp. Scientists, like everyone else, are lazy, and so we have a lot of measurements there near the helicopter or the fixed-wing aircraft landing zone, and a smaller number going upstream. But these are velocities, surface velocities for the ice in meters per year. So for example, if you've ever landed at base camp, you're looking at numbers like 100, 120 meters a year is how fast the ice is going. Like, half a meter a day, maybe a little less than that. The other thing is Matthias Braun, that German scientist, helped us by using sequential images that were taken by a satellite, actually radar imagery, and using some fancy computer software to measure offsets or movements of the crevasses and the little pebbles and the other things visible in that radar imagery. And these colors, which match up with this color bar right here, are velocities that were estimated by him based on that satellite imagery. So we combine those two data sets, and this line right here is what we have said is the trajectory of the turds as they go downstream. what I'm going to do next is show you the velocities from this map just along that transect, what we believe to be the turd transit line. Here we are measuring in distance downstream from the 11 camp. All of this work that we did is downstream of the 11 camp because above there's ice falls that are too complicated. So from 11 camp down to the terminus, elevations we can mainly ignore, but let's just look at velocities. Those are all these blue marks. There's the blue dots and also the blue lines. It's a mix of those two data sets. And this is what we use to say how fast are the turds moving. So if you take a poop at the 11 camp, it's going to move downstream at something like 50 meters a year. It accelerates as you move down towards base camp. Base camp is right around here, and so you've got velocities in meter. Actually, base camp is closer to right about there. But you can get to the highest velocities downstream of base camp of 450 meters a year, more than a meter a day. So this glacier's cooking along pretty good. But we're going to use this information to try to figure out when the turds are going to come out. But to do that, I won't dwell on this much, but we have to figure out the mass balance of the glacier. This is how much does snow accumulate and how much does ice melt every year. That's what scientists call mass balance. And we need that to know as it's moving downstream, how deep does the poop get in the accumulation zone, and then how rapidly does it melt out. So we went up, and this was a lot of the work I did with Tucker Chenoweth on that patrol. We dug a bunch of snow pits and measured snow densities and blah, 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 and we came up with this fairly simplistic looking curve here. We don't need to dwell on it except to say you need this information and the velocities to predict when these things are going to come out. And this is the result. So I made a simple computer model that takes this information into account, tracks your turds as they go downstream, and I'm showing you the results for 4 different camps. That's 11, Ski Hill, 7, 8, and base camp. Notice that base camp has its own little trajectory because it's in a tributary. And color-coded, here's your emergence zones. So for base camp, you would expect, based on our predictions, the first poops to be emerging at the surface in about 70 years. For the camps that are upstream of there, it's going to take longer. The good news is that if you poop at the 11 camp, you got a couple centuries. You don't have to look at it again. But if you live a long time, you might, just be able to. I was told that you can determine whether you're stressed by looking at your own feces. So at least in theory, you might be able to see how you felt the day you flew into base camp and how you felt at the end of the trip, if you live long enough and you start early. So the point of this, these could be wrong. They're probably not wrong by much, but it's a prediction. The point is, it's as Roger said, most people thought thousands of years, right? Maybe millions. But the first use of the airstrip up at base camp, I think, was in 1954. And the first expedition on the West Buttress was in 1951. So we should be seeing this soon, is what I'm saying. Now, the use was there wasn't a lot of use at that time. And so looking for, Brad Washburn's poop is going to be like a needle in a haystack. But once those plywood latrines were in, and you had 1,000 climbers a year sitting at base camp pooping in one hole, I'm predicting that you're going to find that, about 70 years later.
1977 was the first toilets at base camp.
Yeah. So we got a little time yet. But not a lot, right? This is within the planning horizon, I hope, of the managers of the park. It's not something that we can put off for, out of sight, out of mind. Okay, so we did go down and look on a couple occasions just opportunistically when the helicopter was available. We didn't find anything because we could be so wrong that it's already emerged, but there's no sign of that yet. So that's good news. It's something to keep looking for, because something we'd really like to do is actually test that stuff when it melts out. But we can't do that yet. So the next set of results I'm going to show you have to do with ways that we tried to get at the question of, well, what is it going to be like when it melts out? We couldn't measure that directly. Yeah, Raj?
One other way we'll know when it shows, because all those earlier years
Yeah, that's right.
So with the garbage that may show up, we'll see the waste.
Yeah, that's right. And another spoiler alert, Roger's photo of that, I was glad to see, I never saw that before, that photo of a newspaper. If a newspaper can survive burial in, in a glacier, maybe so can 2 metric tons of poop. Okay, so quickly, I needed a better graph. I don't even want to talk about this. It's too complicated. But the point of it is, if you look at the mass balance of a glacier and then you warm it up, the climate's warming, the equilibrium line moves up from its current position up higher on the glacier. And we did some tests, little numerical simulations. What if the climate warms up and makes the equilibrium line of the glacier go higher, which of course it's already doing. So it's not really a what if. And just as sort of a test, we said, what if we make the equilibrium line go up 10%, which is 188 meters? So, 500 or 600 feet, move the equilibrium line up over some period of time. What does that do to the time it takes for those poops to emerge? It shortens those emergence times by anywhere between 13 and 27%. So what I'm saying is this is an underestimate, it's an overestimate of the time it's going to take for these poops to come out. Like 71 years for base camp is probably wishful thinking. It is going to be sooner because of climate change. But we didn't try to predict how much climate change. We just, well, what if? Okay, so we know that it's coming soon. Okay, so what is it going to be like? So this was the part of the project that made me nervous. I'm not a microbiologist. I've never been a poop scientist. I thought I'll get a graduate student. But where will I find a student eager to work on poop? And I found Katie Goodwin. She came into my office looking for a research project. She had just gotten off 2 years of consulting, working in Juneau, sampling the effluent from cruise ships. She was all about it. She knew the techniques, and she thought going and hanging out on Denali would be fun, and she wasn't afraid to touch poop. And so I was like, Katie, you are on. So she did a few things, and I'm going to summarize them in the next 3 slides. The first is she did an experiment. What is it like for a poop in a glacier? Now, we already heard today that the microbes in poops like it cool, and they don't like the sun, and they like to have lots of nutrients. And that is what it's like in a glacier. A glacial environment is not, we don't think, brutal for the microbes in poops. It's cool. It doesn't go through freeze-thaw cycles. It stays right at the melting point at 0 degrees Celsius once it's buried. And there's no UV light down there. So it's actually, and if it's in company with 2 metric tons of other poop, we don't think nutrient scarcity is an issue. So we did these experiments where we subjected poops in a lab to those conditions, but not for 71 years because we couldn't do it. But we did it for 150 days, and we tried some different controls, different treatments, but basically they were all sort of trying to simulate the environment within the glacier. I have to say that Katie collected from her fellow graduate students 5 kilos of poop and stirred it all up in a tub and then put it into 800 individual vials for this experiment. Bless her heart. And what she found is no detectable mortality of the coliform or E. coli or Enterococcus bacteria in the waste. Only 150 days, but no detectable mortality. So that's one result that we think implies that they're going to do just fine for some period of time in the glacier. Now we wanted to do some field work. The park buried a poop a long time ago at base camp, and we.
Old outhouse. That was one of my projects.
Oh, you put You put magnets in an old outhouse hole. We tried to find it, we couldn't. So Katie said, let's redo the experiment. So one time when she was at base camp, she dug a deep hole. She put a poop in it of her own, and then I came out. This is Anthony Arendt, a University of Alaska Fairbanks researcher that studies the Kahiltna Glacier, and he and I, we used Reco chips instead of magnets. We thought that was better. It worked great. We found it, and we dug a 5.5 meter deep hole. I went down there, and it was at this point, Anthony's taking my picture, that he said to me, "You know, Mike, you're a professor and you've got this all wrong. You're not supposed to dig up your grad student's poop. Your grad student should be digging up your poop." And he was right. I felt the fool because it was dripping wet. And again, the temperature inside a glacier is in Alaska is at the melting point. It's 0 degrees. That's when water freezes, but anything that's wet with impurities in it is going to freeze at a lower temperature. So they don't even freeze down there. They're not even frozen poops that we're talking about. They're wet, nasty poops. And we tested them, and they are nasty. It was all still, so that was a year that it sat down inside the glacier, shallowly buried, still biologically active, still full of bacteria. So more evidence that this is a bad news. And then this is the third thing, and it's a little complicated to explain, and I don't want to go too long. One thing we did is we measured the snow at the commonly used camps before and after the climbing season. And that's what some of this is, and it's not that important to what I'm talking about except to say we actually, at the end of the climbing season, the really heavily used camps up there, were mostly the snow is amazing. The snow, like the dirty-looking snow where people were pitching tents all season, was mostly uncontaminated by any fecal bacteria. The only place that wasn't true is in pee holes, which that's not surprising. But one little detail here that's pretty neat is that one of the rangers, I don't even know who, there it is right there, F5 collected.
It's a mountain guide.
Oh, it's a mountain guide. I got it from the rangers, but who do we have to thank for that? I don't know.
Mount Trip.
Roger was talking about how cooperative the guides are on Denali. One of the guides carried an old turd from F5 down to base camp and gave it to the rangers, and they gave it to us, and we tested it. This had been sitting on a wind-scoured ridge for at least a year up near the summit, where it doesn't get buried, where it's not at a constant temperature, where the climate is brutal, and it was still full of E. coli and coliform bacteria. So in 71 years, is there going to be bacteria in the waste that melts out, or 200 years? We can't say with certainty, but what we can say based on all this and based it on our reading of the literature is there is no evidence to suggest it won't be biologically active. If anyone has evidence to the contrary, I'd welcome it. This has been published. No one's debated us. I think it's pretty clear that it's not a bad environment for poop to maybe be the bacteria in it to be kind of dormant, but when it comes back up, it's still poop. That's the point. And we did our best to demonstrate that. So one other thing, and for me this was the most amazing result of this study, is we sampled water down. This is the terminus of the Kahiltna Glacier. Here's the Kahiltna River coming out in multiple streams. And then, like a lot of big valley glaciers, there's tributary streams that may have glacial sources, but that come in from the sides of the glacier as water. And those water sources join the subglacial plumbing system and then emerge out the Kahiltna Glacier. And so 2 years in a row, we tested some of those tributary streams and the various outlets of the glacier to see if there was any fecal bacteria in those water sources. And what we found 2 years in a row is that maybe there's bears and wolverines and the very occasional climber or backpacker up in those valleys, but the water coming into the glacier from the sides is clean. The water coming out the central and western side of the Kahiltna Glacier is clean. And 2 years running, the streams coming out of the eastern side, which is where the flow of that fork of the glacier comes down, has got E. coli and coliform bacteria in it. So that's amazing to me. This is a huge glacier. It's a huge river. There's not even any waste at the surface yet. But meltwater, the way we interpret this is meltwater that's percolating down from the surface of the glacier to the bed is encountering crevassed waste in the ice, passing through it, leaching out some of the poo, and in this huge glacial system is carrying detectable amounts of coliform bacteria out into the Kahiltna River. This result has been found in one other place that I'm aware of, this study that was done on a much smaller glacier in Switzerland. I have to emphasize that this statement right here, the amount is not large. It exceeds drinking water standards, but EPA drinking water standards are super strict. Recreational waters of the United States have a higher limit to how much E. coli and coliform is okay, and it's below that. So you can swim in the Kahiltna, but you can't drink it, is what we learned. That's right where it comes out. Further downstream, it's going to get diluted. And besides, how many people drink the Kahiltna? None. How many people swim in it? Well, a handful raft it, and if they fall out. So this is not a huge human health threat with present usage, but that waste is impacting the rivers today. That's what we found out. And you can expect that to increase over time as the waste starts to emerge. And what we haven't measured, but we will, is when it emerges, is what happens to the surface meltwater streams. And most of you in this room have hung out on glaciers and have drank water out of a meltwater stream on the surface of the glacier. And if you're like me, that's the one time that you're like, I'm not filtering. Actually, I never filter my water. But that feels good, right? Like, that's clean water. And it's not going to be on a certain part of the Kahiltna once these things melt out. Question?
I don't want to interrupt your speech, but when you're done, and you and I talk, because there's a group from the University of Washington Urban Water Center, they developed testing techniques now to test for water that's contaminated. They also test then for anything in it that's only associated with humans, like caffeine, like chocolates, like ibuprofen, like medicine.
Well, you can find the chocolate just by tasting it. No, I'm not kidding. No, we should talk. We should, yeah.
Correlation between E. coli and humans.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can come from a variety of
It could. You're right. And I do want to do that, but I want to return to this. That's why we made these measurements. Those are by far the most likely sources for non-human contamination, and we tested them, and they're clean. But it would tighten our argument if we did that, and I'd like to, so yes. Okay, so just quickly, summarize our findings and talk about what it means. So A, hurrah, Roger, hurrah, John, hurrah, all the Denali Rangers, the present management strategy, hurrah, Paul, mostly effective along the climbing route and keeping glacier surface clean. It works. It's a really effective management strategy. However, waste will emerge on the glacier surface within decades with some error bars. The emergent waste will be intact and biologically active. The glacier will not grind it into dust. It doesn't do that to anything else. I don't see why it would to the waste. The buried waste is already contaminating the Kahiltna River, although moderately. And when the waste emerges, it'll contaminate surface waters on the glacier as well. In a place that's not often visited, but climbers do go down there, in particular, at least once a season, to go down to like Little Switzerland to the Pika Glacier from base camp. So that's what we know. So now just quickly, it's not my job to solve this, as I said, but what can we say about whether that's a problem that can or should be solved? The climbing route's good. What about this stuff that's coming out downstream? Well, the park asked us to do this. They said, can you, as a part of this project, help us assess what would be the financial cost and the carbon footprint of what we're doing now, and then a couple different alternatives that they gave to us. So these aren't alternatives that are about to be implemented. Other solutions might be implemented, but just for the purposes of discussion, we went through 3 alternatives, and I'm going to show you what they cost. The current practice, I'm not going to go through all this because it's already been described. This is what they're doing now. An intermediate option, intermediate meaning not as intensive as a full pack out, would be every climber gets a CMC, but they can't dump it in a crevasse. So maybe when they get up to 14, on the way up, and they've filled it part way up, they can dump it in some sort of barrel up there. When they come down off high camp, they dump it in the barrel again. And so the waste accumulates at 14 and at base camp, and it all gets flown off. The waste that accumulates at 14 would by necessity come off by helicopter, and all the waste would come off the mountain. Or the full pack out, the difference being that you're not using a helicopter to help, would be, this would be the third option, 2 CMCs, you cart those up, you fill them both up, you carry them all the way down, and you fly out with your air taxi with them. And you've carried all your waste out. So those are the 3 options. There's others, but these are the 3 we tested. And we're going to do this one at a time. This one is the costs, and this one is the carbon footprint. So first, these are set up in the same way. The red bars for the 3 different strategies, 1, 2, and 3, are what does it cost to set the program up, to buy the CMCs, whatever else might be necessary. And then the green bars are the annual operating costs of it. What does it cost each year to keep the program going? And there's a gigantic spreadsheet. It's in the report we did for the park that gives away all the sources of this. The students who worked on this were really thorough. I just want to highlight the main points. First, in terms of upfront costs, what is making the full pack out so much more expensive? It's that you have to buy twice as many CMCs. Okay, so and that's, we're talking an investment if you started from scratch of, almost $200,000. The other big thing that you would note is in terms of operating costs, the intermediate strategy is the most expensive by quite a bit, by at least $50,000, close to $50,000, because that's the one that has a helicopter buzzing back and forth, picking up waste at the 14 camp. Easier on the climbers, more expensive. And for scale, these are dollars in thousands. So like that's 80,000, 100,000, just to point out what the units are there. Okay, what about carbon emissions, the carbon footprint? And this is taking into account everything, making a CMC, flying a CMC from Kansas where they're made to Alaska, moving them around on the mountain, driving them down to Anchorage to get them cleaned by truck, everything. So what are the main things that come out here? Well, in terms of the upfront costs, the full pack out is by far got the biggest carbon footprint. This is really surprising. It's because of many people here flew here. Good God. Flying is, I'm going to get rid of my bike and start driving all the time, because if you fly at all, nothing else you do matters. I double-checked the numbers. Flying a little dinky CMC from Kansas up to Anchorage International Airport is far and away the biggest carbon emission associated with the program. Buy local. This is the lesson of this. I couldn't believe that, but it's true. And then when you look at the operating costs, not surprisingly, the biggest one, again, is the intermediate one, because the difference here is you have a helicopter flying back and forth to the mountain, whereas in both of these options, the waste is going in and out on the same air taxi flights that is taking in and out the climbers. However, the full pack out is greater. This difference between this one and this one, since it's the same number of flights, that's that truck driving down to Anchorage full of dirty CMCs all the time. So if Roger installs an even bigger vermicomposter in Pam's garden, we could bring this down, because that's the biggest effect right there is Roger's, is the trucks, as opposed to doing it in Talkeetna. So at least based on this intermediate option is expensive and has a pretty big carbon footprint. Remember that this upfront carbon emission is just a one-time thing, and the park already has a bunch of CMCs. So, but there are costs to all these programs, as you all know, and we took a stab at quantifying them. So there's base camp, sort of beautiful in a kind of Barnum and Bailey sort of way. It's like a circus. I just want to finish with a couple thoughts about this. I think I feared when we published this and found out all these results that it would be used as ammunition by the most conservation-oriented people to argue that every climber has to carry 2 CMCs up the mountain and back down again full. Because I have a lot of friends that either guide on Denali or work on Denali or go climb it for fun, and they'd all kill me. That would be hard. It would be really hard to carry all your waste off Denali. It's the best way to solve this problem. And I don't want to argue here that it's not the right solution, but I worried about that because I'm not really advocating either solution. What I'm trying to point out with these results is that the current practice, which is super effective at keeping the climbing route clean, has a downstream effect. There's a downstream effect, as Roger pointed out, of sending it to a waste treatment plant. I live in Anchorage most of the year, and I run past that plant. It stinks, and it's not a tertiary treatment plant. It's a primary treatment plant, and they ship pretty nasty waste out into Cook Inlet from that water treatment plant. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that waste melting out on the glacier is terrible and waste going to a waste treatment plant is awesome. Everything that we do with poop has a cost, has an impact, let's say. But what we've tried to do is show what that impact is on this glacier. And I think it's a really tricky problem to weigh the costs against the costs of implementing a complete solution to this against the costs of those poop piles melting out. And I think my opinion is that my work is mostly irrelevant, because actually I think the most important thing, and so again this is just my opinion, is that actually the biggest problem with this is not a wastewater or a water contamination problem or human health problem. I think it's sort of an ethical and aesthetic problem that in what is truly one of the remote parts of the park, the lower Kahiltna Glacier, where almost nobody goes, we're going to have, big nasty piles emerging at the glacier surface. And on the one hand, almost nobody goes there, and we'll see them. But on the other hand, in our national parks, I think we have traditionally celebrated the most remote, most wild places and worked hardest to protect them. And what we're doing with the current practice is exporting the mess from the heavily impacted area into the pristine area. And I think that's tricky in a national park setting to answer whether that's appropriate or not. So I don't know, but that's what we know. That's what we found. I'm just going to end with this. I won't list all the names, but all the people that helped, really thank the rangers who facilitated this, and that's my talk. Do I have time to answer questions, or did I go too long? Just two, okay. Yeah?
I was wondering, you mentioned some Swiss studies, because I remember, I think 10 or 15 years ago, big mountain huts in Swiss mountains, they've going pipes down to the crevasses of much smaller and shorter glaciers than you have here.
Yeah, so the study I cited is from the Mont-Main Glacier. I wish I could say that I know where that is or even pronounce it right, but it was done by some actually Montana State researchers. And this is one, I think it's on the Haute Route, I'm not sure. But in any case, it's on that glacier. It's a very small one. It has a hut right at the top, and the waste goes into the Bergschrund. And so, but if there's more studies like that, there's certainly more situations like that, but if it's been studied anywhere else, I would love to know about it. Yeah.
Did you analyze the costs, to account for the steeper upfront costs versus the...
Well, we just broke them out. So that upfront cost would be, like if next year you were going to start one of those management practices from scratch, before the climbing season begins, you would pay the upfront cost that we put in those red bars. And then every year, including that first year, you would pay the green bar. And that's for costs like rangers enforcing it, flights, trucks driving around. So we explicitly broke out the ramping up costs to keep them separate. Not including the upfront costs. No, just operating costs. You could, but then there'd be the question like, well, do you amortize that over 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? And I barely know what amortize means, so I chose to keep it separate. But you're right, you could do that, and I think an economist would.
So, I'm glad that you mentioned that you think it's going to be an aesthetic issue, not a public health issue, when all
Are you speaking of when we did the sampling around the camps at the snow surface?
At the base, when, held out when we did the eco.
In the river.
Yeah, the river.
We did one sample one year and one sample the next year. So we didn't get replicate samples from each stream in a given year. That would be great to do that. We didn't do that, but
To make it statistically significant, you need at least 100 samples probably
yeah,
to differentiate. So it's just
I'd be happy to do that if someone wants to fly me up there. I'll get 100. Yeah, but no, agreed. I made recommendations in the final paper to the Park Service about this project for next steps they could undertake, and one is a much more rigorous annual water sampling program. And that,
want to make it based on sampling that wasn't significant, make judgment.
yeah, agreed.
Thank you very much.